Hey guys, welcome back, or maybe welcome for the first time, to another episode of history you didn't know you needed, but now can't unhear. Tonight we're dimming the lights, fluffing the metaphorical pillows, and easing into the strange, slightly tragic, and occasionally absurd world of, drumroll if you have the energy, Roman sleep rituals. Now I know what you're thinking. The Romans gave us roads, aqueducts, and gladiator movies. But did they give us a solid night's sleep? Well, not really. Their sleep patterns, to put it kindly, were about as organized as a toga party after too much Falernian wine. And yes, that was their favorite wine. Imagine the hangovers. So if you're already lying in bed, feel free to close your eyes, because nothing I'm about to say is urgent. It's all about how ancient Romans tried, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, to drift off to dreamland. Spoiler, they did not have melatonin gummies. Instead, they had rituals involving everything from goose fat to gods you've probably never heard of, and beds that, honestly, sound like medieval torture devices disguised as furniture. Let's start with the big picture. The Romans didn't sleep the way we do. Forget your modern 8 hours straight through. That was not the vibe. Instead, they tended to sleep in chunks. A nap here, a doze there, a midnight stroll to sacrifice something to Jupiter, you know, the usual. Historians sometimes call it segmented sleep. Basically, people went to bed not long after sunset, woke up in the middle of the night for a few hours, because why not? Then went back down until dawn. It's like nature's version of Netflix binging, but without Netflix or electricity. And in those midnight hours, Romans would do everything from reading scrolls to whispering prayers to, of course, plotting political assassinations. Because nothing says me time like conspiring against your brother-in-law emperor at 2 in the morning. But what about the physical act of going to sleep? Let's glide into that. Roman bedrooms, or cubicula, were not what you'd call cozy. They were often tiny, dark little chambers with just enough space for a bed and maybe a lamp. No windows unless you count a hole in the ceiling. The point wasn't comfort. It was, well, privacy. And privacy in Rome usually meant you were either trying to nap or trying to avoid whichever relative wanted to borrow money. Now let's talk about those beds. Roman beds were basically wooden frames with straps of leather or rope stretched across, covered by a thin mattress stuffed with reeds, straw, or if you were lucky, wool. Does that sound supportive? Not really. The rope sagged, the straw poked, and you spent half the night rolling to avoid lumps. It makes you wonder if Romans invented insomnia before inventing glass windows. Wealthier Romans could upgrade to mattresses stuffed with feathers or even goose down. But then, of course, you had to deal with feathers sticking out mid-sleep, poking you in the ribs. So luxury had its limits. And let's not forget the pillows. Romans liked them soft, but not too soft, because they believed an overly squishy pillow could corrupt your moral character. I'm not making this up. According to some moralizing writers, indulgence in physical comfort made you weak. So if your pillow was too comfy, you might as well prepare for societal collapse. Which, spoiler, Rome eventually delivered anyway. Maybe they should have just bought fluffier pillows. Speaking of moralizing, Roman philosophers loved to weigh in on sleep. Take Seneca, the great Stoic thinker. He said things like, "Sleep is but a rehearsal of death." Very relaxing, Seneca, thank you. Nothing helps you drift off like being reminded that you're basically practicing for your funeral every night. But if you wanted something more practical, Romans had their household gods, those little shrines in the corner called lares and penates. People would sometimes whisper prayers before bed, asking for good dreams, safe sleep, and protection from nightmares. Nightmares were a big deal. They weren't just bad dreams. They were considered omens, messages from the gods or restless spirits. So naturally, Romans had rituals to guard against them. For example, some people hung amulets over their beds. These could be little carvings of Hercules, because who better to fight your dream demons than the guy who killed a hydra? Others relied on herbs. Poppies were popular. Yes, those poppies, the ones with opium inside. A poppy garland under your pillow could supposedly bring restful sleep. Although, let's be real, the restful part was probably the opium talking. Let's float now to the subject of insomnia. Because yes, Romans had it too. Ancient writers complain about restless nights, tossing and turning, worrying about debts or political rivals. Sound familiar? Human anxiety really hasn't changed much. Remedies included drinking warm milk, still recommended today, or rubbing yourself with oils, particularly chamomile or rose. One recipe even suggested smearing goose fat on your temples, which sounds fragrant. Imagine rolling into bed with goose fat dripping down your face. Romantic. Another favorite cure was to recite poetry. Not read it, recite it aloud. Epic poetry like Virgil's Aeneid, which is basically 12 books of men wandering around being sad. If that didn't knock you out, nothing would. And if you were truly desperate, you could always hire someone to drone on and read it for you. So yes, the Romans actually invented the bedtime audiobook. Except instead of Audible, it was your household slave forced to read about Trojan ships until you passed out. Of course, if you were wealthy enough, you could go full ritual mode. Priests and healers prescribed little ceremonies to lure sleep back. These could include sacrificing a small animal, like a dove, or scattering grains of barley on your floor while chanting. I'll just say, it worked about as well as counting sheep. And we can't talk about Roman sleep without mentioning dreams. Romans were obsessed with them. They believed dreams could predict the future. Entire books were written cataloging dream symbols. Dream of losing a tooth, someone in your family is about to die. Dream of eating figs, congratulations, wealth is on its way. Dream of falling, clearly the gods hate you. This was a full-time business. Dream interpreters set up shop and charged clients to decode their nightly nonsense. Which brings us back to the strangeness of segmented sleep. Those middle-of-the-night waking hours were often the prime time for dream analysis. You'd wake up, light a lamp, mutter about the nightmare you just had involving goats in togas, and then try to figure out if Mars, the god of war, was sending you a message. Then, once you'd exhausted yourself with overthinking, you'd crawl back into your straw mattress and hope to pass out again. And of course, not everyone had the luxury of fussing over dreams. Soldiers, for instance, took sleep where they could find it, on the ground, in their armor, with one eye open for ambushes. Sleep deprivation was basically part of the job, which may explain why so many generals were grumpy. But back in the city, ordinary Romans had their own challenges. Noise was constant. If you lived in Rome, the streets were full of carts, animals, drunks, and shouting well into the night. Laws even tried to restrict nighttime wagon traffic because people kept complaining they couldn't sleep. Did it work? Not really. Imagine trying to doze off while a donkey pulls a cart of amphory outside your window at 2 a.m. Sweet dreams. And then there were the neighbors. Roman apartments, called insulae, were thin-walled, overcrowded, and stacked several stories high. If your upstairs neighbor decided to stomp around, or your downstairs neighbor was running a tavern, good luck getting rest. It was a little like living in a college dorm but with more fire hazards. So how did Romans cope? Some went to country villas where at least you had crickets instead of traffic. Others just embraced naps. The midday meridiatio was basically sanctioned laziness. Shops would close, people would rest, and then return to business in the afternoon. Honestly, the siesta system might be the one thing Rome got right in the sleep department. Now, before we drift too far into dreamland ourselves, let's pause and think about the bigger picture. Sleep in ancient Rome wasn't just biological, it was social, spiritual, even political. Who you slept with when you slept, and how you dreamed could all carry meaning. And while they didn't have blackout curtains or white noise machines, they had their own toolkit of gods, goose fat, and grumpy philosophers. All right, let's float onward. Because Roman sleep had plenty of bizarre twists left, including emperors who could barely sleep at all, night terrors that supposedly changed history, and rituals so strange they make counting sheep look like advanced science. So we've set the stage with ordinary Romans fumbling around with straw mattresses, noisy neighbors, and goose-fat remedies. But now, let's glide up the social ladder. Because if you thought the average Roman sleep was strange, just wait until we peek into the bedrooms of the emperors. The irony of Roman power is that the more you had, the less you slept. Which sounds familiar, right? These men were technically the most powerful individuals in the known world. They could order armies around, command senators, and demand exotic fish from Spain at 3 a.m. But when it came to actually lying down and closing their eyes, absolute disasters. Take Augustus, the very first emperor. Mister, I saved the Republic by ending it. You'd think he'd be snoozing peacefully on a bed of laurels after all that. But no, Augustus had chronic insomnia. Ancient sources tell us he would wander the palace halls at night, calling for his servants to read to him, or even just talk to him until he dozed. He tried different sleep positions, different rooms, even naps on couches in various corners of his house. Imagine being so restless that you rotate bedrooms like someone scrolling Netflix, hoping the next show will finally hit. And in a way, it's not surprising. Augustus lived through endless civil wars, betrayals, and assassination plots. Sleep doesn't exactly come easy when your career where paranoia and guilt made the night feel like one long fever dream. Now, let's drift away from politics and step into something a little stranger. The Romans didn't just think of sleep as rest. They thought of it as medicine. In fact, for some, the best doctor wasn't a doctor at all. It was a god who came to you while you slept. Yep, welcome to the world of incubation rituals. Basically, So far we've tiptoed through noisy Roman bedrooms, haunted palaces, and incense-filled dream temples. But now it's time to slip back into the more ordinary world. Because let's be honest, most Romans didn't have the time or money to spend the night in a temple waiting for a snake to bless their dreams. Most of them just wanted to get some rest between work, family drama, and dodging falling roof tiles in their overcrowded apartment blocks. Which meant home remedies. The ancient equivalent of Googling, "Why can't I sleep?" at 3 a.m., except instead of blogs and wellness influencers, you got advice from Pliny the Elder or your neighborhood herbalist. And let me tell you, some of these remedies make counting sheep look like a cutting-edge science. Let's start with the most famous Roman cure-all, cabbage. Yes, cabbage. Romans were obsessed with it. Cato the Elder, the cranky old senator who hated Carthage and thought vegetables were morally superior to luxury, declared that cabbage was practically a miracle drug. Got indigestion? Cabbage. Sore throat? Cabbage. Trouble sleeping? You guessed it, cabbage. His advice was to eat it boiled, raw, or sometimes just rub the juice on yourself. Imagine being told that your insomnia could be solved if you simply bathed in cabbage water. Cozy, right? Pliny the Elder doubled down on this idea in his Natural History. According to him, cabbage could even sober you up after a wine binge, which might explain why Roman banquets often included cabbage courses. It was basically the Tums of antiquity, except smellier. Whether it actually helped people sleep is debatable, but hey, at least you were too distracted by the bloating to worry about your dreams. Next on the list, goose fat. We mentioned this earlier, but it's worth savoring. Some Roman medical texts recommend smearing goose fat on your temples or eyelids to help bring on drowsiness. Why? Honestly, no one knows. Maybe it was the soothing ritual of rubbing something warm and greasy on your skin, or maybe the fumes just knocked you out. Either way, I can only imagine how romantic it was to roll into bed smelling like roast poultry. Nothing says sweet dreams like eau de goose. Another popular trick was poppy seeds. The Romans were well aware of the sedative properties of poppies. They didn't isolate morphine the way later cultures would, but they certainly understood that drinking poppy-infused wine or chewing on poppy seeds could make you feel very, very sleepy. Of course, moderation was key. Too much, and your sleep might be a little permanent. Roman doctors walked a fine line between gentle nap and oops, funeral. If poppies weren't your style, you might try lettuce. Yes, the humble lettuce. Romans believed lettuce had cooling, calming properties. In fact, Emperor Domitian was so obsessed with lettuce as a sedative that he would lecture guests at banquets about its benefits. Imagine being forced to sit through a long dinner where the emperor won't shut up about salad. Lettuce, for them, wasn't just a side dish. It was basically NyQuil. And then we come to wine. Naturally, Romans loved wine and they often recommended it as a sleep aid. But not just any wine. Sweet, watered-down varieties were considered most effective. Strong, bitter wines were thought to inflame the body and stir the mind, while lighter ones lulled you gently. Physicians would often prescribe a cup or two before bed, which sounds relaxing, until you remember that Roman wine was sometimes mixed with resin, honey, or even seawater. Sweet dreams, indeed. But wait, it gets stranger. Some remedies involved chanting. Magical formulas whispered at bedtime were thought to calm the restless mind. One surviving charm goes something like, "Sleep, you who are in the heavens, let the eyes of this child be closed, let him sleep sweetly." Very soothing. Others were less poetic, more like mumbling nonsense syllables believed to confuse evil spirits. Honestly, it's not far off from singing yourself to sleep with half-remembered song lyrics. And then there were the amulets. Romans loved amulets. For sleep, you might wear a pendant with certain stones, herbs, or animal parts sealed inside. Amethyst was popular. It was supposed to guard against drunkenness and promote calmness. Some people carried little sachets filled with herbs like chamomile or dill, kind of like an ancient aromatherapy diffuser. Others preferred more dramatic options, like tying a wolf's tooth around their neck. Because nothing says bedtime serenity like jewelry made from predator teeth. If all else failed, you could always turn to rituals involving spit. Yes, spit. One method suggested spitting 3 times into your right shoe before lying down. Another involved spitting on your pillow while muttering a protective prayer. Was it hygienic? No. Did it probably just make your pillow damp? Yes. But hey, it was tradition. Other suggestions leaned more practical. Galen, the famous physician, advised avoiding daytime naps if you wanted better sleep at night. He also recommended going for a walk after dinner, keeping your room cool, and not eating too much rich food before bed. Sensible, right? Unfortunately, this advice was usually ignored in favor of feasts ending at midnight, with plates of dormice stuffed with nuts. No wonder Romans needed all that cabbage. And let's not forget the ever-classic, just read something boring. This was practically a Roman specialty. Wealthy insomniacs would have a servant read philosophy or legal texts aloud until they drifted off. One writer even jokes that listening to public speeches was the best sleep aid of all. Imagine lying in bed while someone drones on about grain tariffs. Works every time. Children, of course, got their own remedies. Roman nurses might rock them while chanting lullabies, rub them with oil, or hang protective charms over their cradles. Some of these charms were shaped like little fists or phalluses, symbols meant to ward off evil. To modern eyes, it looks a little questionable, but in Roman culture, these symbols screamed safety. It's all about context. Now, not all remedies were harmless. Some involved heavy doses of opium, mandrake root, or henbane, plants with real narcotic power. Taken carefully, they could induce sleep. Taken carelessly, they could induce, well, death. Roman doctors sometimes recommended mixing these herbs into wine, which created a potent sleeping draught. It worked, sure, but you had to trust your doctor's measuring skills. And let's just say medical malpractice insurance didn't exist. Still, there's something oddly relatable about all of this. The Romans fussed over their sleep the way we do. They blamed noise, stress, bad diet, or even demons for their insomnia. They tried food hacks, herbal teas, weird rituals, and reading until their eyes closed. If you squint, it looks a lot like modern sleep advice. Just swap the cabbage juice for magnesium supplements and the wolf teeth for weighted blankets. And yet, for all their efforts, Romans never really solved the problem. Sleep remained fragile, easily disturbed by the chaos of urban life, the stress of politics, or the sheer unpredictability of ancient existence. Maybe that's why so much Roman literature is filled with weary complaints about the night. Insomnia was as Roman as gladiator games and bad plumbing. So, as you settle deeper into your own hopefully goose-fat-free bed, take comfort in this. People have been fighting insomnia for thousands of years. If cabbage water didn't fix it for them, and lavender tea doesn't fix it for you, you're in good company. All right, let's drift onward, because there's one more dreamy corner of Roman sleep culture we haven't explored yet, their relationship with death. Romans saw sleep as the cousin of death, and their tombs, epitaphs, and poetry are filled with this eerie, tranquil overlap. So in our next section, we'll float gently into how Romans connected falling asleep with falling into eternity. Sweet dreams, but make it existential. So far, we've padded around Roman bedrooms, peeked into the sleepless palaces of emperors, sat through dream temples with sacred snakes, and smeared goose fat on our foreheads for science. But there's one thread running quietly under all of this Roman sleep talk, and that's the uneasy way Romans linked sleep with death. To them, the two weren't just cousins. They were practically twins, close enough that every time you nodded off at night, you were basically rehearsing your funeral. Relaxing thought, right? Exactly the sort of thing Stoic philosophers love to whisper about when you were already struggling with insomnia. The Roman language itself gives it away. Words like somnus, sleep, and mors, death, were constantly paired in poetry. Ovid casually calls sleep the image of death. Virgil paints sleep and death as siblings, drifting side by side in the underworld. Even little tomb inscriptions would sometimes say, "He sleeps here," as a softer way of saying, "He's very, very dead." Honestly, it's not that different from how we still say someone is resting in peace. The metaphor has some staying power. But Romans didn't just wax poetic about it. They built the idea of sleep has death into their culture. Take their funerary art. Sarcophagi often showed the deceased lying down as if in bed, reclining, calm, like they'd simply dozed off. It wasn't grim. It was strangely domestic. The message was, don't be afraid, death is just one long nap. Of course, that's easier to write in marble than to actually believe at 2 a.m. Philosophers leaned into this metaphor hard. Seneca, champion of gloomy bedtime thoughts, said, "Every night we practice dying." He framed sleep as a daily lesson in letting go, a rehearsal for the big exit, which is beautiful if you're in the mood for reflection. Less beautiful if you just wanted a quick nap before market day. Imagine lying there, staring at the ceiling, muttering, "Yes, I too am practicing for death." Not exactly ambient. But the overlap wasn't always grim. Sometimes it was oddly comforting. Sleep meant temporary escape from the chaos of Roman life, the noise, the debt collectors, the neighbors hammering upstairs. Death, in its poetic sense, offered eternal escape. For the weary Roman, both sleep and death were framed as relief, a kind of cosmic do not disturb sign. Now the imagery gets even stranger in myth. The Romans borrowed heavily from the Greeks, who personified sleep as a god named Somnus, Hypnos in Greek. His twin brother was Thanatos, god of death. Twins. Identical but not identical, one tucks you in for a few hours, the other tucks you in forever. The Romans loved this neat symmetry. Artists carved Somnus with soft wings on his temples, gently touching mortals to bring slumber. Death, by contrast, was often shown as sterner but still quiet, laying a hand on your eyes. In both cases, the gesture was almost tender. Of course, Romans being Romans, they also added a layer of superstition. Dying in your sleep was considered both enviable and a little suspicious. On the one hand, it was peaceful, the kind of exit everyone wished for. On the other hand, it could be read as punishment from the gods, a sudden snatching away. Families might perform extra rituals if someone slipped away in the night, just to be sure no restless spirits lingered. And speaking of restless spirits, nightmares played a huge role in how Romans saw the border between sleep and death. A nightmare could be a visitation from the dead, a relative reminding you of unfinished duties, or just a random demon out to mess with you. Romans often left offerings at graves to pacify the departed and hopefully keep them from showing up in dream form. Imagine being woken up by Grandpa, not because he's proud of you, but because you forgot to leave him some wine at his tomb last week. Even funeral practices tied back into sleep. Tombs were often described as houses of eternal sleep. Epitaphs could read like bedtime instructions. "Traveler, do not disturb, he rests well." Some even included miniature beds or pillows carved into the stone. It's strangely tender, as though the living were tucking their dead into bed forever. The connection also made its way into Roman daily speech. People avoided blunt words like dead in casual conversation. Instead, they said someone was sleeping. Euphemisms softened the blow. A soldier might write home that his comrade had gone to sleep in the camp of the blessed. It sounds poetic until you realize it means someone got skewered in battle. But let's glide back to the household level. Ordinary Romans, especially parents, leaned heavily on the sleep-death metaphor when soothing children. Lullabies sometimes included lines like, "Close your eyes, little one, like you will someday forever." Yes, that's exactly as creepy as it sounds. Apparently, nothing gets a toddler to drift off like existential dread wrapped in song. To them, it was normal. To us, it reads like early training in stoicism. And then there's the practice of sleeping near graves. Some Romans believed you could receive visions of the dead if you slept on a loved one's tomb. This practice overlapped with dream incubation, but instead of a healing god, you were hoping grandma might stop by in dream form to give advice. Morbid, sure, but to the Romans, it was another way of staying connected. Now let's not forget Christianity's arrival in the later empire. Christians absolutely loved the sleep-death metaphor. They described the faithful dead as asleep in Christ, waiting for resurrection. Roman catacombs are full of inscriptions like "dormit in pace," he sleeps in peace. It caught on so strongly that we still use the phrase today, shortened to RIP. So next time you see it on a gravestone, remember it's a Roman lullaby, whispered across 2,000 years. Even emperors leaned into this overlap. Take Hadrian, the wall builder and world traveler. Toward the end of his life, he wrote a little poem to his soul, calling it his wandering guest that would soon depart, pale, naked, silent. It's one of the most famous Roman epitaphs because it treats death exactly like a weary soul being tucked into bed after a long journey. For a man who spent so much time packing his palace at night, it's surprisingly gentle. But naturally, not everyone found comfort in this metaphor. Insomniacs in particular dreaded the association. If every night felt like a rehearsal for death, then insomnia felt like a rebellion against it. Some Roman writers joke that sleeplessness was proof they weren't ready to let go, which is relatable. Who hasn't stared at the ceiling at 3 a.m. thinking, "Not yet, thanks"? The overlap even bled into legal customs. Romans often described death in wills as eternal sleep. Executors would sometimes stage funerals where the deceased was laid out as if sleeping peacefully, surrounded by candles. The whole setup blurred the line between bedroom and tomb. The bed became a stage for both sleeping and dying, which is probably why so many Romans were so anxious about their beds. Too lumpy and it reminded you of coffins. Too soft, and philosophers warned it was decadent. Either way, no pressure when you're just trying to nap. So in the end, what do we get from all this? That Roman sleep was never just about sleep. It was about life, death, morality, the gods, and the eternal tug-of-war between rest and restlessness. Every night was a mini-drama. Would you rest peacefully like Somnus intended? Would you wake tormented by nightmares from the dead? Or would you lie awake, haunted by philosophy and cabbage juice? And maybe that's the most Roman thing of all, taking something as ordinary as sleep and making it cosmic, tragic, poetic, and slightly ridiculous. It wasn't just bedtime. It was practice for eternity. So as you lie back now in your much comfier modern bed, maybe breathe a little sigh of relief. You don't have to smear goose fat on your face. You don't have to dream in a temple with snakes. And you don't have to wonder if every nap is a rehearsal for death. You just get to sleep. And that, honestly, is the greatest luxury of all. All right, we've wandered a long way together through bedrooms, palaces, temples, kitchens, and tombs. We've watched emperors pace, listened to philosophers lecture, and smelled way too much cabbage. And now, at the end of this long drift through Roman nights, maybe it's time to close your eyes, take a deep breath, and rest. Because unlike Caligula, you actually can. Sleep well. So far, we've looked at Roman bedrooms, their weird sleep rituals, and the whole sleep equals death poetic thing. But let's be real. None of this matters if you're living in the middle of Rome itself. Because the truth is, and I hate to break this to you, ancient Rome was loud. Like New York subway construction at 3 a.m. loud. If you imagine Romans reclining gracefully on their couches, drifting into dreamland with soft harp music playing, no. The reality was more like being trapped in an airbnb above a 24-hour kebab shop next to a construction site, with bonus donkeys. Let's start with the streets. Roman traffic was constant, chaotic, and noisy. Even though Julius Caesar, in his eternal wisdom, once tried to ban carts from entering the city during the day, that didn't solve anything. It just shifted the noise into the night. So picture this. You've finally fallen asleep on your straw-stuffed mattress, and suddenly you're woken up by the screech of wagon wheels grinding against stone and the rhythmic clop of hooves echoing down the narrow streets. Add in the occasional driver yelling obscenities because another cart cut him off, and you've basically got the Roman version of late-night highway rage. And let's not forget about the water. Aqueducts were marvels of engineering, sure, but they fed into public fountains that gushed and splashed all night long. Constant running water might sound soothing today, like those white noise apps, but Roman fountains weren't exactly gentle trickles. They were loud, messy, and often accompanied by people shouting at each other while filling jugs at 2 a.m. because, of course, that's the ideal time to stock up for tomorrow's chores. Now add in animals. Lots of animals. Rome wasn't just humans living in close quarters. It was donkeys braying, dogs barking, chickens squawking, and the occasional escaped pig rooting around in alleyways. Martial, the sarcastic Roman poet who complained about literally everything, once wrote that it was impossible to sleep in the city because of roosters alone. Which honestly is a mood. One rooster crowing is annoying. Dozens of them, scattered across apartment rooftops, each convinced they're the main character of dawn. That's insomnia with feathers. And don't even get me started on neighbors. Roman apartment buildings, insulae, were notoriously thin-walled, crowded, and flammable. Privacy was not a thing. If your upstairs neighbor decided to practice the lyre at midnight, congratulations, you were part of the audience. If the guy next door got into a screaming match with his wife, you were basically invited to the domestic drama. And if someone dropped a chamber pot out the window, well, let's just say you learned to close the shutters before bed. Of course, Romans didn't just tolerate this, they complained about it. Loudly. Writers like Juvenal and Martial are full of whiny lines about never getting a moment's peace. Juvenal grumbles that city noise was so relentless that the only way to sleep properly was to escape to the countryside, which, if you were wealthy, you could. But if you were poor, tough luck. Your lullaby was oxen, drunk stumbling home from taverns, and the eternal squeak of cart wheels. Speaking of taverns, they were another source of sleepless misery. Roman bars and snack shops stayed open late, and they were not quiet. Singing, brawling, gambling, people reciting poetry they thought was profound but probably wasn't. It was all part of the soundtrack of the Roman night. Imagine trying to doze off while some tipsy guy downstairs is belting out bad Homer impressions. Not exactly ASMR. And then there were night watchmen. Rome had its version of security patrols, but they weren't subtle. They clanged, stomped, and shouted as they made rounds. Some even blew horns to signal the passing of time, which sounds useful unless you're trying to sleep. Imagine living in a city where every few hours someone loudly announces the time just so you know exactly how little sleep you're getting. Even religious practices added to the racket. Temples held nighttime rituals, sacrifices, and festivals, often involving music, chanting, and occasionally processions. The goddess Cybele, for instance, was worshipped with drums and flutes that could last through the night. So if you happened to live near her temple, you'd better be a heavy sleeper or very, very devout. And because Rome was Rome, there were also random emergencies. Fires broke out constantly in those wooden insulae. Floods, riots, political unrest, all of these had a way of breaking up the night. Imagine dozing off, only to be shaken awake because the Tiber decided to rise again, or because a group of angry senators' clients were throwing rocks outside. Just another Tuesday in the capital. Now the Romans weren't clueless. They knew their city was sleepless and they adapted. For some, the solution was napping. Romans were big fans of the midday rest, the meridiatio. If you couldn't get proper shut-eye at night, you just dozed off after lunch, which worked fine unless you had one of those jobs that didn't allow midday naps like, say, gladiator. In that case, too bad. The wealthy, of course, had other options. They could escape to country villas, where the air was fresher, the nights quieter, and the only nighttime noise was maybe a shepherd's flute. Writers like Pliny the Younger constantly bragged about how peaceful their country estates were, which, let's be honest, was basically their way of rubbing it into every city dweller stuck listening to donkeys at 3 a.m. But even for the rich, the noise followed them. If the emperor decided to throw a triumph or games or any sort of spectacle, the celebrations could go on for days with drums, horns, shouting crowds, and fireworks. Well, ancient Roman versions of fireworks, basically loud firecrackers. No one in the city slept until it was over. You couldn't exactly ask the emperor to keep it down. So what did Romans actually do about all this? Not much, honestly. They grumbled. They wrote sarcastic poetry. They fled to the countryside if they could. And they accepted that sleepless nights were just part of urban life. After all, Rome wasn't just the eternal city. It was the eternally noisy city. When you think about it, this explains why Romans were so obsessed with sleep rituals, remedies, and metaphors. They lived in a place where rest was constantly under siege. So they poured wine on their pillows, prayed to Somnus, smeared goose fat on their foreheads, and hoped that somehow, despite the roosters and wagons and tipsy poets, they'd manage a few hours of oblivion. And maybe that's the real Roman sleep secret. Not a magic herb, not a fancy bed, not even a dream temple. Just pure, stubborn determination to catch some rest in a city that never shut up. So the next time you're lying awake because of a noisy neighbor or a car alarm outside, maybe take comfort in the fact that you're basically experiencing life as the average Roman did. Annoyed, sleep-deprived, fantasizing about a villa in the countryside. Some things, apparently, never change. So far, we've spent a lot of time in Roman bedrooms at night, trying to sleep through carts, roosters, and philosophical guilt trips. But here's the thing. The Romans didn't rely only on the nighttime for rest. They had a built-in backup system, a cultural cheat code, and that was the midday nap. The Romans called it the meridiatio, basically, the siesta. And if you're picturing them stretched out in togas, lazily dozing off after stuffing themselves with olives and wine, congratulations, you've got the right idea. Daily Roman life was divided into chunks. You got up early, sometimes very early before sunrise, did your business, visited clients, argued in court, sacrificed a goat or two if the mood struck, and then by midday the city was hot, dusty, and insufferable. That's when everything slowed down. Shops closed, the streets emptied, and people retreated indoors for food and, ideally, a nap. Seneca, our ever-grumpy philosopher friend, admitted that he loved a good midday rest. He called it a little death without the inconvenience, which is about as cheerful as he ever got. Pliny the Younger, meanwhile, bragged that he took his naps like a disciplined Roman gentleman, short, efficient, refreshing. Not for him the long, decadent siesta of the lazy masses. No, Pliny was a serious napper, which is a phrase I think we can all aspire to. But not everyone approved. Romans were suspicious of too much sleep. Hard work and discipline were the values they wanted to project. Too much napping smelled of decadence. The kind of thing Eastern monarchs did while lounging on silk cushions, surrounded by eunuchs. Real Romans, they claimed, were supposed to be up and about, conquering Gaul, managing estates, yelling in the Senate. So of course, everyone napped anyway, because who doesn't want a break after trudging through dusty streets in heavy wool? Even soldiers were known to sneak in midday rests. The army actually had scheduled downtime in the heat of the day, which makes sense. You can't exactly march 20 miles under a Mediterranean sun without collapsing. Better to snooze in the shade than pick up the conquest later. For ordinary Romans, naps were practical. Most people lived in noisy cities where night sleep was patchy at best. The siesta filled in the gaps. You got a few hours at night, then topped it up after lunch. It wasn't indulgence, it was survival. kind of like how modern office workers rest their eyes at their desks, pretending they're not actually asleep. We even have funny little references to kids being forced to nap. Roman parents, much like modern ones, seem to struggle with children who absolutely refuse to sleep in the middle of the day. Lullabies survive that literally beg the child to rest so that mama can get some peace. Some things never change. Now, Romans didn't always nap in beds. Often, it was wherever you could collapse. Reclining couches in dining rooms were common. Some people stretched out in porticos, shaded gardens, even temples. If you were wealthy, maybe you had a special daybed, a lighter, fancier piece of furniture designed just for lounging. If you were poor, maybe you curled up on a bench in the forum and hoped nobody stole your sandals while you were out. The meritio was also social. Some elite Romans used it as a kind of downtime with friends or clients. Picture a group of men in togas, half asleep on couches, mumbling philosophy at each other. Honestly, it sounds like half of grad school. Others turned it into a romantic excuse. Ovid, the eternal troublemaker, actually suggested in his poetry that the midday nap was the perfect time for sneaking into someone's bedroom. Subtlety was not his strong suit. Of course, no Roman nap was complete without medical commentary. Doctors loved to weigh in on the proper timing, length, and posture of naps. Some said you should nap sitting up to avoid indigestion. Others warned that too much napping caused headaches, melancholy, or, my personal favorite, looseness of the bowels. Which, if true, is a pretty strong anti-nap argument. Still, people did it anyway because doctors are always spoilsports. Even emperors indulged. Augustus, the great stabilizer of Rome, was famously fond of short naps. He claimed they kept him sharp, which is a neat spin on "I like to sleep in the middle of the day." Tiberius, meanwhile, was known to disappear into his villa on Capri for hours of afternoon rest, though in his case it was probably less about refreshment and more about avoiding people he didn't like. Honestly, relatable. But no one outdid Hadrian. He was notorious for napping anywhere, anytime. Friends joked that he could fall asleep mid-conversation, mid-meal, probably mid-sentence, which made him sound more like your drowsy grandpa than a Roman emperor. But hey, when you're running an empire, maybe snoozing on the job is self-care. Now, naturally, Romans found ways to make even napping competitive. The elite liked to brag about how disciplined their naps were. "I only sleep 20 minutes at midday," one senator might say. "Any longer and it's effeminate." Meanwhile, ordinary Romans rolled their eyes and happily slept through the hottest hours, which, honestly, was the smarter choice. The meritio even crept into Roman law and custom. Courts didn't meet in the blazing middle of the day. Markets shut down. Official business paused. Everyone knew that between noon and early afternoon, nothing important was happening. You could try to be productive, but good luck finding anyone awake. It was like an unspoken truce between citizens and the sun. The siesta culture lasted long beyond Rome itself. Medieval Europeans inherited it, and in many Mediterranean countries, the midday nap is still a thing. Which means that every time you flop on the couch after lunch, you're basically participating in a 2,000-year-old Roman tradition. Congratulations, you're historically lazy. But perhaps the most Roman thing about napping wasn't the act itself. It was the way they managed to moralize it. They turned it into a debate about virtue, masculinity, health, and philosophy. Should a man nap? How long is acceptable? Is it decadent to lie down for an hour? Is it un-Roman to dream in the middle of the day? These were the hot takes of the ancient world, which makes you wonder maybe people haven't changed that much. Today we argue about hustle culture versus self-care. Back then they argued about siestas versus soldiering. Same debate, different furniture. So in the end, Roman naps were more than just naps. They were survival in a noisy city. They were little escapes from the heat. They were excuses for gossip, romance, and philosophy. They were, in short, the backbone of Roman rest. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Romans may have lived in a world of constant chaos, but they still carved out time to flop down, close their eyes, and recharge. And if the emperors of Rome, busy, paranoid, constantly in danger of assassination, still found time for a nap, then maybe you can too. So the next time you sneak a midday rest, don't feel guilty. Just tell yourself you're doing it the Roman way, efficient, historical, and maybe just a little decadent. Hey guys, tonight we're doing something a little different. You've had a long day, your brain is buzzing, and your bed is hopefully cozy. So let's dim the lights, settle in, and wander somewhere far away, ancient Rome. Not the Rome of gladiator battles and shouting senators, not the Rome of epic conquests and crumbling ruins, but the Rome of quiet nights, restless citizens, and all the little rituals people used to fall asleep. Because it turns out, Roman sleep culture was just as messy, strange, and oddly relatable as our own. And that's the vibe for tonight. No drama, no shocking reveals, no sudden loud moments. Just a slow drift through Roman bedrooms, temples, and philosophies with a little dry humor along the way. If you're here to relax, you're in the right place. So let's start simple. What did Romans actually do when it got dark? Picture a Roman city at night. Forget the romantic postcard image with moonlight glinting off marble. Think instead of noise, clutter, and very little privacy. Streets were cramped. Tenement walls were thin. Neighbors were loud. Carts rattled until dawn. Dogs barked, drunks sang, taverns spilled noise into the alleyways. Not exactly ideal conditions for restful sleep. In fact, one poet, Juvenal, grumbled that in Rome, it was practically impossible to get through the night without being woken by something or someone. Inside homes, things weren't much better. Wealthy Romans had sprawling villas, sure, but even those were drafty, echoing spaces with hard surfaces that carried sound. Poorer Romans had tiny, insular apartments stacked like shoeboxes, with straw mattresses and thin doors. The concept of peace and quiet was about as mythical as Hercules. And yet people did sleep. They had to. The human body demands it, which meant Romans developed a whole culture of coping strategies. Some of them feel oddly modern, others less so. For example, they believed in what we'd call segmented sleep. Instead of one long 8-hour stretch, Romans often dozed in 2 or more chunks, waking in the middle of the night before drifting off again. This wasn't considered a problem. It was normal. In fact, the Latin word for midnight literally means middle of the night, which was often a socially acceptable time to get up, pray, write letters, or even visit a neighbor. Imagine that. A culture where sending a midnight note wasn't seen as rude, but totally fine. And then there were naps. Romans loved naps. The word siesta might be Spanish, but the practice was very Roman. Afternoon rest, especially in hot weather, was practically sacred. The philosopher Seneca praised short, refreshing naps, though he also complained about noisy neighbors ruining them. So yes, even 2,000 years ago, people were writing cranky complaints about the guy upstairs. Some things never change. Now when it came to actual sleeping arrangements, class mattered. Rich Romans slept on proper beds with mattresses stuffed with feathers, wool, or sometimes, if you were unlucky, hay. Poor Romans made do with straw, rags, or even bare boards. Bedding could be surprisingly fancy, though: embroidered covers, imported linens, dyed fabrics. The rich wanted to look stylish even while unconscious. And because Romans loved hierarchy, even slaves had designated sleeping spots. Sometimes in cramped corners of the household, sometimes literally at the foot of their master's bed, ready to be summoned. Imagine trying to get some rest with your boss snoring 3 feet away. The act of sleeping itself carried cultural meaning. Philosophers often framed it as a kind of rehearsal for death. Sleep was seen as the little death, a temporary surrender of control, which of course meant Romans turned it into something to moralize about. Too much sleep was laziness. Too little sleep was self-destructive. The ideal, according to Stoics, was moderation, enough rest to function, but never indulgence, because nothing horrified a Stoic more than being seen as indulgent. Doctors, meanwhile, offered plenty of advice. Roman medical writers like Galen gave long, detailed instructions about when to sleep, how to sleep, and even what position to use. Side sleeping was recommended. Sleeping after a heavy meal, a terrible idea. Going to bed too early or too late, equally bad. Honestly, it sounds like they would have loved writing blog posts about 10 best sleep hacks according to science. And of course, when natural sleep didn't arrive, there were remedies. Romans experimented with herbs, potions, and even amulets. One recipe suggested rubbing goose fat into the soles of your feet. Another called for drinking cabbage juice. Frankly, neither sounds appealing, but hey, people were desperate. Some turned to poppy-based concoctions, basically ancient sedatives. Others relied on prayers and rituals, calling on Somnus, the god of sleep, or Hypnos in the Greek tradition. There were also protective charms to ward off nightmares, since dreams were considered spiritually significant, sometimes even prophetic. Speaking of dreams, Romans took them very seriously. A dream could be a message from the gods, a warning about the future, or at the very least, a juicy bit of symbolism worth decoding. There were professional dream interpreters who made a living explaining visions. Entire books circulated cataloging dream symbols. Dream of a snake, that means danger. Dream of bread, prosperity. Dream of cabbage, maybe you drank too much of that juice earlier. In any case, Romans blurred the line between sleeping and spirituality in ways that feel both mystical and slightly ridiculous. And yet all of this mattered, because at its core, Roman sleep culture was about control. They wanted to control their bodies, their dreams, their rest. They believed a well-ordered life required well-ordered sleep, which, ironically, probably just made them more anxious about not getting enough. You can almost picture a Roman lying awake at night, worrying about whether their posture was too indulgent or whether So let's leave the emperors packing in their palaces and check in with the everyday Romans. Because while Caligula was busy threatening the moon, most people were just trying to get through the night without losing their sanity. Picture yourself in an insula, one of those Roman apartment blocks. They were tall, crowded, and usually built by landlords who believed safety regulations were something for the gods to sort out. Wooden staircases, thin walls, drafty windows. It was less home sweet home and more good luck surviving. You're lying on a straw mattress. It scratches. It smells faintly of mold. And then the soundtrack of Rome begins. First, the wagons. They weren't allowed in the city during the day, so all the deliveries came at night. Picture wooden wheels clattering over stone, echoing through narrow streets. Add in the drivers shouting, animals braying, and the occasional crash. Not exactly soothing white noise. Then you've got drunks staggering out of taverns, singing badly, dogs barking. Street vendors who, for some reason, thought dawn was the perfect time to start yelling about their fish. Juvenal, the eternal grump, once claimed you couldn't sleep a wink in Rome unless you lived in a wealthy villa far from the noise. And honestly, he had a point. Even inside, quiet was rare. Families crammed into single rooms, slaves sleeping in corners, bobbies crying, neighbors coughing. Privacy was basically non-existent. So the Roman strategy, complain, adapt, and occasionally threaten legal action against noisy neighbors. Yes, there were actual lawsuits over late-night disturbances. Imagine dragging your neighbor to court because his rooster wouldn't shut up. Very Roman. Of course, not all Romans accepted sleeplessness passively. Some developed elaborate bedtime routines. Warm baths were popular, especially in households that could afford private heating. The idea was that soaking your body in hot water relaxed the muscles and prepared you for rest. Not a bad plan, honestly. Physicians like Galen also recommended light suppers, avoiding heavy wine late at night, and even gentle walks after dinner. Basically, ancient sleep hygiene. But then there were the quirkier remedies. Goose fat rubbed into the soles of the feet, as if your toes were somehow the gateway to sleep. Cabbage juice, because apparently cabbage was the cure for everything. Poppy-based potions, which were, well, effective, but maybe a little too effective since opium was involved. And then there were charms. Small amulets hung above the bed, whispered prayers to somnus, even ritual gestures before lying down. If modern people have sleep apps that play rainfall sounds, Romans had talismans carved with little protective figures. Different gadgets, same desperation. And sometimes sleeplessness wasn't seen as a medical issue but a spiritual one. Maybe a ghost was haunting you. Maybe a god was angry. Maybe someone cursed you with insomnia. In that case, you didn't need a doctor, you needed a priest or a magician. Rituals might include burning incense, chanting spells, or sleeping with special herbs under the pillow. Superstitious, sure. But when you're wide awake at 2 a.m., even goose fat starts sounding reasonable. Now, if you did happen to wake in the middle of the night, Romans didn't always fight it. Remember that segmented sleep. Midnight was often a natural pause. People would get up, light a lamp, maybe snack, maybe talk quietly with family, maybe even visit a neighbor. There are references to people reading or writing letters in the dead of night, as if it were just another time slot in the day. Imagine receiving a scroll at 1 a.m. from your friend across the street. Hey, couldn't sleep, thought I'd drop by. No one thought it was odd, it was just life. And that's what makes Roman nights so fascinating. They weren't quiet and they weren't linear. They were fragmented, full of interruptions, full of improvisation. If you couldn't sleep, you found something else to do. Maybe you prayed. Maybe you wandered the courtyard. Maybe you listened to storytellers in taverns or even hired entertainers to perform at private night gatherings. For the wealthy, insomnia could turn into a kind of social event. For the poor, it was just one more thing to endure. But through all of this, the Romans kept attaching meaning to sleep. It wasn't just a physical need, it was a moral statement. Oversleeping. You were lazy, decadent, un-Roman. Undersleeping Maybe you were disciplined, or maybe you were a nervous wreck. Balance was the ideal, but balance is always the hardest thing to achieve. It's strangely comforting in a way. We think of Rome as this mighty, unstoppable empire. Yet at night, it was full of ordinary people tossing, turning, muttering about noise, trying remedies, worrying about curses, and praying for rest. 2,000 years later, not much has changed. The streets are quieter, maybe, but the basic human struggle with sleep is the same.